Well, hello, everybody. This is Pastor Connor, and today we are continuing forward through the Augsburg Confession. Just a quick, short article for you today, and that is that which we write and confess about the pastoral office. And this is one that people might disagree with me here, but this is one of our articles which is no less important confessionally, theologically, or practically that is in truth. And yet, in the public practice of common Lutheranism, at least in a lot of contexts in the North American continent, it is treated as though it is completely irrelevant. Yet it is not. And I think another example, maybe not another example, because I haven't given you an example. What I should say is probably the best example of this is found in our small catechism, or the printings of it. And there are reasons why people print it with and without this one section, and that is on the office of the keys, right? Some editions of the small catechism, they have the office of the keys, but most published in the North American context do not. And what I think is absolutely shameful there is that that is, if not, I would say, one of the most obvious things to people who are just starting out in Christianity to explain to them, or which they're wondering about. What is this whole thing of the pastoral office? Why do churches have a pastor? Why aren't we brethrens? Why? And that's a real question. Why aren't we brethrens, right? And now we'll come back to this question, why aren't we brethrens, in a little bit of a second, but let's just talk about the article itself, and that is Article 14 of the Augsburg Confession. Again, one of the sadly most ignored articles of the Book of Concord, mainly out of fears for quote unquote clericalism, the boogeyman of low churchers everywhere, and of clerical abuse and all such things. So the article goes this way. It's very simple. It's very short. Concerning church government, it is taught, that is, we teach it, we confess it, we believe it as true. No one should publicly teach, preach, or administer the sacraments without a proper public call, that is, ordination, right? Now, you can say it does not include ordination and strip it down to just the call. That is a conversation in itself, and something that we have to, how would you say, discuss that as that kind of works itself out in regard to what the small catechism has to say on the office of the keys, in regard to what Philip Melanchthon writes for us in the Apology of the Augsburg Confession, in regard to what we see in our larger dogmatic tradition, of course, with scripture at the back, as the backbone of all of this. But just to put this simply first for us, what this means is clear. What this means is not up for debate. This means lay preaching is not a Lutheran thing. It is not allowed to happen in our churches. Lay sacraments is not allowed to happen in our churches. Now, here's another thing. There's not two things here in this article, preaching and sacraments. There's a third. What is it? Teaching. And again, this is so ignored in the North American context that people feel as though anyone can teach anything in a church context, as long as we say it's not preaching, but teaching. We see this happening at synodical conventions, especially in contexts where female ordination to the office of the ministry and preaching is not permitted. And so they end up being delegated to things like teaching at convention this, or synodical convention that, or teaching theology here, or doing it there. That's where a lot of this starts. That's where a lot of this hits the ground running, and we start ignoring what our own confession is. But I want to take this a little bit to a more serious level. Not to say that's not serious, but what I want to say about this is that you have to ask yourself the question, why? You have to ask yourself the question, why? To do that, you have to understand what the office of the ministry is. Now, because that's not really included within this article of the Augsburg Confession, we're not going to delve into the whole depths of this, right? This is left in those printings of the small catechism. This is left in something that we see later on in the Apology of the Augsburg Confession, something that we see later on in the rest of the Apology in the treatise on the power and the primacy of the Pope, and later dogmatic tradition. Maybe you'll see more about this later when we cover the concept, the idea, the development of the Church's understanding in West and East about the office of the ministry, priesthood, pastorate, episcopate, presbyter, all of these different concepts and things. But let me just put this in simplest terms for you now. God ordained for the church an office of pastoral care. That is for preaching, that is for teaching, that is for the administration of the sacraments. That which pertains to that office is to be done by those who hold that office. Those who do not hold that office are not to do those things, right? And a lot of people, they like to say, oh, priesthood of the believers this, priesthood of the believers that. Let me hit you with some hard facts. The same concept of this priesthood of all believers that you see in the New Testament, it also existed in the Old Testament, where they were to be a nation of priests. And yet they had ministerial priesthood. That's not to say that we're to now call the New Testament pastorate the priesthood, although the Book of Concord often does, and call our pastors priests, so there's nothing inherently wrong with that. What I do want to say about this is that that doesn't mean anything, right? If that did, then in that Israel was a nation of priests, they would have no priests, yet they had priests, right? Now, that's even if you have a ministerial priesthood. If you don't, it becomes even less of a point, right? For example, some would say, well, you're all about this whole pastors thing, but we're, the priesthood of believers. And I would say to them, you don't even believe that your pastors are priests, so what does that have to do with anything, right? You can say priesthood of all believers, yet you don't believe that there are priests who minister in a ministerial capacity. And so the logical conclusion there would be, yeah, sure, all are priests, only some are pastors. If you have a ministerial priesthood, it would work the exact same way it did in the Old Testament. Still, the point is not granted. The truth remains this, that God has ordained and instituted a particular Christian office for preaching, teaching, and the administration of the sacraments. And so who should do it? Those who have that office. Now, a separate question is who can do it? Now, let me say, we will cover this question on Blood and Bone as we talk more about that and developments of that and the episcopacy and that whole mess. But simply put, I just want to say the whole conversation and debate is entirely irrelevant. Instead of saying, what is it possible to do? What can I do? You should never ask those questions. Rather, what should you ask? What should I do? You know what you should do. God instituted this office of the pastorate. God, if he's not given it to you, you should not do the things which pertain to the pastorate. If you want to do those things, what should you do? You should become a pastor. If you're not fitting those requirements, you should not do those things, right? And what we fail to understand in our Western democratized culture is this notion of submission to the will of another. And this is especially important in regard to God, right? I know a lot of people who tell me for other reasons, maybe they disagree with some synod or some church's position on women in office, and so they say, oh, I know people who are qualified. Not according to God's qualifications, right? Take women out of the issue. Even if a man has all of those qualifications and he says, I will be a pastor, God's calling me to be a pastor, yet he doesn't have the call which comes through the church. He doesn't have the call. This conversation of the internal call, that's not the proper public call. The call comes through the church. And this is another thing we need to understand about Augsburg Confession, Article 14. Again, it's simple, it's small, but it's not to be taken in and of itself. What this is doing, what kind of purpose it's serving, we've spoken about this throughout this Augsburg Confession series. It's working on this basis, on this foundation of Western Catholic tradition and Western Catholic canon law, basically. And this is discussed later on in the Apology of the Augsburg Confession, where Melanchthon says, yes, we would have loved to retain the historic Western Catholic episcopate, but it is at the moment impossible for them. They did end up later recovering that. However, at the moment, it was impossible. Yet he proclaimed, this is ideal. This is what we were aiming for, right? So either way, what I want to say about this is We cannot just say, oh, there's lots of wiggle room here because it's a small article. First of all, there's not a lot of wiggle room because of how clear it is. Second of all, as the Augsburg Confession works itself out, it assumes the truth of what has always been done. Okay, unless said otherwise. So we'll end there. Again, it's small, it's short, so this episode is small and short. As we come back, we'll be talking about church regulations, and then we'll just continue to move forward. A lot of the stuff will be moving forward a little bit faster as we move away from the doctrinal issues towards some of the church abuses. There's some exceptions there, such as Article 24 on the Mass and Article 20 on good works, and that of end times and last judgment stuff. But yeah, let me just recap this for you. God has instituted an office of the ministry in his church for teaching, yes, preaching, not the same thing, and the administration of the sacraments. And those who are to do those things are those who have that office. That office comes from the call of the church and is administered and placed upon that person through the laying on of hands of ministers. This is the only example that we see in the New Testament of the Holy Scriptures. There is no exception. There is no other tradition in the Holy Church. So anyways, end the debate there, submit to the will of God, submit to the thing we've always done, which we know is true, which we confess to be true, and stop being so weird about it. Alrighty.